Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I'll be pretty short because honestly, most of the points that I wanted to make have already been covered by Barbara, Andre, and Eric. But I wanted to talk about the prospects of a follow-on agreement, and not just a nuclear agreement, but also agreements that cover other areas of contentious areas between Iran and the West in particular. But I think the JCPOA experience has really demonstrated two inconvenient truths. Number one is that the JCPOA does not serve either side's core demands. The reality is that Iran is seeking the kind of economic normalization that the kind of sanctions relief that the JCPOA offered did not materialize and will not materialize in the future. So there is a need for Iran to get more sanctions relief and especially relief from primary US sanctions. And some of these demands, by the way, are already coming up in the negotiations that are ongoing in Vienna. The second reason is that the deal is unstable as long as the tensions between Iran and the US and their respective allies in the region persist. And we have learned, um, based on the experiences of 2015 and 2016, that regional tensions could easily spill over into the implementation of the nuclear deal. And so you need to be able to also de-escalate in the region. Now, I think in all of this, there lies an opportunity for one or more better for better agreements, especially prior to the 2023 deadline of the JCPO, some of JCPOA's sunsets setting in. Now, one of the questions that comes up all the time is whether Iran would have enough incentive to negotiate a follow-on agreement. And there are two elements to this. One is if the US goes back into full compliance with the JCPOA, which means that it has to provide Iran with significant sanctions relief, would it still have enough leverage to negotiate with Iran and incentivize Iran to negotiate? And the second is, with the hardliners coming to power as of August in Iran, would they be interested in negotiations? And I'll try to answer both of these questions. Number one is, I think what drives Iranian incentive is not necessarily the amount of sanctions that the US has in its back pocket, but it's the prospect of instability in the agreement. I mean, you just look at the calendar of JCPOA's implementation, and there's already a very clear milestone, the transition day in 2023, when the US Congress is supposed to lift, not just suspend, the sanctions that are outlined in JCPOA. And the Iranian parliament is supposed to, in response, ratify the additional protocol. Now, we know Congress is not going to do that, and the Iranian parliament is not going to ratify the AP, which means that by October 2023, both sides would once again be in violation of the JCPOA. So we're not going through all this pain of reviving the agreement only to see it collapse again by 2023. And remember that that's also the time that the next round of campaign for US presidential election starts. And you know, the Iranians have already been through this experience of seeing the doors of their economy open up only to see it shut down a year and a half later. And the kind of instability and unpredictability that that creates in the economy, in the view of many in Iran, is even more damaging than the predictability of living under sanctions for the foreseeable future. So I think that's the primary incentive that the Iranians have. And you can argue that the economic promises of the JCPOA is also the reason that they kept the deal alive, despite the fact that it became an empty shell in the past 3 years. And I think that incentive is going to be there 2 years from now. In 2 years, obviously, we're going to have a hardline Iranian president. We still don't know the outcome of the elections, but we're talking about different shades of gray. For sure, we're not going to have a reformist, open-minded, pro-moderation, pro-engagement president in Iran. But having said this, I think for two reasons, the next Iranian government is likely to be interested in negotiations. Number one, is that you would have a much more a monolithic power setup in Iran. And this would reduce the obstacles that existed with the Rouhani administration from day one, which was this question of mistrust. You saw it in Zarif's leak that really one branch of the Iranian government would not trust the other branch. And this was a major problem with the Rouhani administration that I don't think would exist with the next Iranian president. Now, obviously, Iran will always remain divided, and factionalism will remain as endemic as ever. But nevertheless, I think this question of who reaps the political dividends of dealing with the West would diminish in the next administration. And this is not likely to be another Ahmadinejad administration in the sense that all power will be in the hand of conservatives, but they would be bogged down by infighting. I think the system, given the fact that this president is probably going to be the Supreme Leader's last president, is going to make a careful choice. It will be a highly managed election to make sure that the outcome is totally in line with the Supreme Leader's vision. And so all of that might not be good news for Iran domestically in terms of pluralism and openness of the system, but it is actually, I think, good news for the prospects of negotiations with the West. Iran would be more confident. Now, if I am right in this rather optimistic projection of the possibility of negotiating a follow-on agreement, I think one has to take two key principles into account. One is that the core bargain in the JCPOA, which was nuclear restrictions and rigorous monitoring in return for economic incentives, could not apply to other areas of disagreement, because the nuclear issue, at least since 2003, was not core to Iran's national security, whereas Iran's ballistic missiles program or Iran's support for partners and proxies in the region are core to its national security. And so any concessions on those issues would have to be reciprocated, not with economic incentives, but with security concessions. So I give you an example. For instance, if Iran indeed ratifies or turns the voluntary limit that it had announced a few years ago on 2,000 kilometer range for its ballistic missiles, if it codifies that into law, in return, what could be offered to Iran is an S-400 missile defense system and not an economic incentive. Now, the second principle, I think, is that, as Barbara mentioned, the non-nuclear issues would require a different format than the P5+1 Iran negotiations. As you know, the scope and the membership of the P5+1 is determined by UN Security Council resolution. And I think it's extremely difficult and unwise to either expand the group or the scope of these negotiations. And areas of disagreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia could be addressed both bilaterally, for instance, and in a regional process, which I think now stands a much better chance of starting than ever before in the past at least 3 decades since the end of Iran-Iraq war. Now, that opens other possibilities as well. And Eric referred to this a little bit, but let me give you some more concrete examples. For instance, if you have a regional process in which you have the 6 GCC countries plus Iran and Iraq, so a 6+2 setup. I'm not really talking about a Middle East process, because as soon as you bring in Israel and Turkey, UAE, I mean, it gets extremely complicated, right? So it's much better to focus on the sub-regional level. And there you can actually find, so if you have a 6+2 process led by the United Nations, for instance, or any other impartial actor, and supported by the US and other members of, permanent members of the Security Council, then you're in a position to even solve some of the issues that would be extremely difficult to solve in a follow-on nuclear deal with Iran. For instance, we all talk about extending the sunsets. I think it would be very difficult for the next Iranian government to agree to extending the sunsets, because they were the ones who criticized the Rouhani administration for agreeing even to this 10, 15, 20-year timelines in the JCPOA. So even if they get more for it, I think it will be a tough sell. Plus, the Iranian main logic about not accepting permanent restrictions on their program is that they didn't want to be treated as an outlier to NPT member states in good standing forever, right? Their idea was that they would build trust and confidence in the peaceful nature of their program after several years of implementing the interim agreement and then the JCPOA. In order to become a normal NPT member state. They don't want to create a new category among NPT non-nuclear member states that is just Iran accepting limits that no one else accepts. For them, it's giving away this part of their sovereignty that is totally unacceptable. But if some of these limits or monitoring measures are regionalized, then Iran is no longer an exception to the rule, and it could actually be sold publicly that Iran is leading the charge as one of the early steps towards a region, a sub-region free of weapons of mass destruction. For instance, you can imagine a sub-regional ban on any enrichment above 5% or any plutonium reprocessing. There's no reason why Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other GCC countries and Iraq would not agree to that. A joint venture enrichment facility on one of Persian Gulf islands, for instance, which could involve Iranian neighbors as well. The Emiratis have their nuclear reactor. They should be interested in something like this. Or a multilateral enrichment plant in Iran, something similar to the Urenco model, for instance. Or even something that I think is actually much more of a lower hanging fruit, which is to multilateralize the staffing of Iran's enrichment plants. Now, all of these are now seem distant prospects. I understand that. I'm not being rosy-eyed about them. But I'm just suggesting that with the restoration of the JCPOA and a change in the threat perception of Iran, and more consolidation of power in the hands of a single faction, there are opportunities that did not exist before. And a clear-eyed approach, which is not zero-sum, could really help cultivate some of these opportunities. And I'll stop here. Thank you.